critic is a creature who has views quite like a camel's. Flowers and fruit he scorns. In the flower garden of the honeyed muse he starves unless he finds a meal of thorns. Hello, and welcome to A Meal of Thorns, a critical book club from the Ancillary Review of Books. I'm Jacques. Every 2 weeks, we look at a book, sometimes most definitely a science fiction book, and we ask a scholar or critic to talk us through it, what's noteworthy, weird, good, and less good about it. Today, our selection is Greg Egan's novel Diaspora, and I am delighted to welcome back Eden Kupermintz to talk about it. Eden writes and podcasts about science fiction, politics, theory, and metal. He curates Anarchy SF, he's the editor-in-chief at Heavy Blog is Heavy, and he's written some very cool stuff for the Ancillary Review of Books. He's also one of the hosts of the excellent podcast Death Sentence. Check that out if you have not. And I should also mention that Eden and I are both very involved in the Translated Hugo Initiative, which is a group that's working on getting translated speculative fiction recognized as a category for the Hugo Awards. Eden is the webmaster for that project. Eden, so good to see you. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, for a certain value of well, which I think is what we can all hope for these days. But I'm delighted to be back here and also talking about one of my favorite books of all time, and I think one of the most underrated science fiction novels I know.
Oh, yeah, 100%. Yeah, it's good to have a second and kind of catch up with you a little bit. I feel like I think we had both commented that in 2025, the back half of ours just got kind of nuts.
Yeah.
Really overpacked and overbusy. And now now we were just talking before we started recording that it's gross outside, it's snowing. I just kind of want to go into hibernate mode and not leave the house. So
yeah, unfortunately, the stuff that's been going crazy is still crazy for me. So I'm gonna be flying for work again and all that stuff. So no hibernation for me. But it is what it is. We do what we need to do. I've also been feeling like literature has been crazy for me lately. I always say I've been on a 20-year roll because so many great books are out there and you can read them. But the last year or so, it's been a lot of really good stuff that I've had the privilege to read. So yeah, that's good at least.
What recently have you had that's been sparking your interest?
So I've been running a reading group at the Providence Athenaeum, specifically about the new weird. So for the first time in my life, I have been doing a lot of rereads. Usually I reread, some, seminal books like Lord of the Rings and Ursula, Guin, stuff like that. But now I reread Brian Catling's Earwig, Jeffrey Ford's The Physiognomy, Jeff Vandermeer's The Strange Bird. And these are all books that I love. And it was great to be reminded of why I love them so much. They're really just very, very good. And all of them yielded new things when I reread them, which was really interesting, right?
That's cool.
It wasn't just an experience just to stay updated so I can run a discussion on them. I also rediscovered some stuff. And now I'm reading, so I promised myself that for every novel I reread, I would read a new one so that I'm not stuck in that mode.
Uh-huh.
So I'm reading Jeremy Bushnell's Relentless Melt. It's really good. It's kind of like a detective story. Boston, 1909. The main character, Artie Quick, is a woman who's trying to be a criminal investigator, right? So she has to dress up as a man. And I haven't finished it yet, but I think that Bushnell is kind of building up into an ending that's weirder than I expected. It's not just a supernatural detective story. There's I'm sensing some time travel, multiple identities, he's going to pull a Severian on me, right? And I'm going to find out that multiple characters are actually one character. It's interesting, and the line by line is just gorgeous. It's really well written. It's nice to read it in Providence, right? Boston is, outside my door, more or less. So I've been having a lot of fun with it, and I'm not a mystery guy usually, and this one's doing the job.
Oh, that's cool. That's very, very cool. It's funny you mentioned that, figuring out that balance between rereading and new stuff. That's something I think about a lot.
Oh, yeah.
For me, the last couple of years, I've actually been thinking more the other way, where I feel this pressure to read all the new stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And to some extent, I think as a critic, that's part of what you should be doing, right? And it's sort of a little bit of responsibility. But when I think of sort of big picture, I'd rather be rereading a little more sometimes and coming back to stuff. I don't know.
For me, it's interesting because my approach to this is via music, which is where I started being a critic, right? That's where I come from. And there, the pace of releases is so fast. And there's also a lot of cult of the new, right? Because music is, you can listen to an album 10 times in a week. And now you're suddenly hunting for whatever is new. And I have to actively resist that instinct as a critic because, I listen to some very complex music and some of it only yields not true, but like deeper beauty and deeper complexity on re-listens. Right? You have to sit with some albums for months sometimes to like understand how to relate to them and what they're doing and so on. So I've kind of been thinking about this for over a decade. If you go back to like heavy blog podcasts, there's a lot of discussion there on this kind of stuff. And then I haven't brought it back into books yet. And now I want to make it more of an objective of like dedicating myself to rereading. Also the skill of rereading, like how do you reread? So here's an interesting question for anybody listening. When you reread a book, why do you read it cover to cover? You've already had that experience, right? You've already sequentially went down it. Why don't you skip? Why don't you go back and forth? Right? Not just House of Leaves, right? But any book can be read. Every text is ergodic if you want it to be, right? Like, so I found myself reading cover to cover, and I was like, wait, what? This is just instinct. Why am I doing this? A reflex, rather. And then I started skipping and going back and forth and reconnecting scenes. I was like, oh, wait, there's a lot of potential here to rethink about this work. So it's very interesting.
That's really interesting. I'm always fascinated, particularly around these questions of how much are you paying attention to the new versus like avoiding like incorrectly over canonizing the old. And I think those questions are more in your face with music, right? Like it's a lot more obvious that most people, there's a point between when they're about 18 and 25 where all the music released there becomes like their personal goldies for forever. And I think I know for myself, like I have to work harder to find new music that I really get into compared to like books. Or I think most people don't have this issue with films, right? Like most people keep seeing new films and TV and they like some of it. Whereas they might have a hard time, if they're in their 40s or 50s or older, they might have a hard time naming an album that's come out in 10 years that they like.
Yeah. So I'm going to say something strange, as I want to do. Music is like smell, like scent. A scent and smell, this is like, there's medical research on this, they're closer to the part of your brain that houses memory. They're more connected to memories. And so it's the sense that most powerfully evokes memories in an unmediated way. So there's no like conscious chain of thought. You smell something and immediately you're transported back into that time. Music has that same power, right? And that's why one of the reasons that when you're young, these albums stick so close to you, because when you listen to them 20 years later, they conjure your youth and the state you were in, and also music was shiny and new and everything was groundbreaking, right? Like, I don't know, I'm a huge millennial nerd, right? Like the first time I heard Pink Floyd, the first time I heard, I don't know, Stairway to Heaven, nothing's gonna ever equal, even if there's much better music than Stairway to Heaven, but it's not gonna equal that freshness, that crispness, right? And when I listen to Stairway to Heaven, I'm transported to that experience. So you really have to fight it actively, right? That's another thing I do for Heavy Blog. I have mechanisms. I'm writing a column on them, by the way, called Gears of Eden, which is all of the techniques that I use to not get sucked into the, like you said, the mystification of past works. Books is the same way. I mean, Lord of the Rings is a great book, but there is not really a reason to read it 6-7 times, if we're being honest.
Well, I'm not sure. Oh, boy. You're going to... I don't know if I can hold my silence and be considered to be agreeing with you on that one. But I know what you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, read it if you want it. I'm not telling you what to read. But I'm saying, could you maybe read something else? And by the way, re-understand Lord of the Rings in a way which a reread of the work itself doesn't necessarily give you. I don't know. I'm not policing whatever people are reading. I'm just saying that why do we take certain works that are excellent and then we create this like recurring, I don't know, mastication sounds too derogatory. I don't mean it that harshly, but there is an element of rumination and mastication to it.
That's interesting. We should get on to the book we're talking about. But
yeah,
when you come back to something, whether it's music or book or film that you do know, and this is why I think music is kind of striking me as sort of a metaphor for the other ones here, that for me, part of it is this, even if you're reading a book linearly, if you've read it before, you have this sort of like double consciousness or sort of like foreknowledge of like what's coming in a way that music can sort of kind of do on the first time, right? Because there are these musical movements and sort of like predictable things that music does. It often like a lot of times the effect is it's surprising you and not doing what you thought the chord change was going to be or something. But the way that sort of, that slight, like 2 seconds in the future feeling is part of what it's doing while you're listening to it. I find something similar when I reread books. Before we leave the what have we been reading, I just want to mention real quick, I just finished a very cool book that I think will come out right around the time this is released. Central Europa by Vicente Luis Mora, translated by Rahul Berry. It's this really weird short little book. It's kind of historical fiction. It's in Prussia and I think like the 1820s, 1830s, something like that. And it's this person who is a very transparently unreliable narrator who is like fleeing some other kind of life to become a farmer. And as they're digging up their field, they keep finding these mysteriously preserved frozen bodies. And at first it's like it's people from the Napoleonic Wars. And they're like, that's weird, but kind of makes sense. And then they find people in like full Roman garb. And then later they find people that you, the reader, piece together are from the future, are like from World War II and even further. And then lots of other strange stuff happens. But it's this very, it's very much built around this narrator hiding stuff, even as he is writing what is like his diary, basically. And you having to sort of piece together all these odd things with this like big sort of like magical realist thing in the middle of it. So yeah, really dug it. Barry is the same person that translated Dengue Boy, which is one of my favorite recent reads.
Yeah, I have it up here on my shelf. It's good.
Yeah. It was also just very fun. I've been thinking a lot about, who wrote You Dreamed of Empires?
I know what you mean. I know who you mean. Alvaro Enrique.
Yes, thank you, Enrique. I was listening to a little bit back a podcast where he was talking about being translated and how he actually credits his English version to the translator.
Interesting.
He's like, I really think it's her book. Like she like took mine and did her own. And reading this, I was thinking so much about how Dengue Boy and Central Europa have such wildly different tones on the page. And I was just thinking about that, what that must be like for a translator to try to get that tone across. Because these don't feel like they're Rahul Berry's novels to me, but Berry's clearly done like a really good job of like, well, I don't know if they've done a good job, but they've done a very different job. You know, I can't evaluate because I can't read the Spanish, but...
Interesting. In a way, translators are like virtuosos, right? Because they have to bounce between these styles and translate different styles. And that changes the language. Like Dengue Boy's language is, you know, apologies for the pun, but like it's feverish, right? It's like, it's very intense. And then this other book sounds more contemplative, right? And so on. So as a translator, you also have to change your register, right? And your vocabulary to fit those styles. So it's interesting to think about it as virtuosity.
Yeah. All right. We're done talking about this. Let's talk about Greg Egan. So today we're talking about Greg Egan's novel Diaspora, which was first published in Australia by Millennium Publishers in 1997. Diaspora is a fairly complex science fiction novel of exploration and transformation. Starting around the year 3000, we find that humanity has split into 3 distinct groups. So there's fleshers who live on Earth in either standard human bodies or genetically modified ones. Like, I think there's people who live in the ocean, other like extreme environments. There are Gleisners, which are humanoid robots operated by human-level intelligences. I don't know if it actually comes out and says it, but most of the quote-unquote artificial intelligences in here are uploaded human intelligences or like descended from uploaded human intelligences. And the Gleisners are mostly just out doing space stuff out in the asteroid belt. They're getting ready to go do some like interplanetary, interstellar exploration. And then finally, referred to as just citizens, are these fully virtual intelligences who are living in self-contained polises, and they're able to speed up or slow down their subjective experience of time. They can modify their own minds. They can do all kinds of cool stuff. Almost all of our viewpoint characters are citizens, so that's kind of like the norm that the novel's written from. After an unexpected cosmic event that traumatizes Earth and reveals that there are some big gaps in the standard understanding of physics, many of these citizens embark on a century and millennia and longer quest to explore more of the universe and more of the theoretical underpinnings of the universe. So this novel was nominated for a number of genre awards. It won the Scion and Premio Ignotus, which are Japanese and Spanish awards, respectively. Worth calling out that although Egan has in some ways sort of declined in how well he's known in English markets, he continually racks up wins in translated wins in other markets, which I think is really interesting. Yeah, if people are not familiar with Egan, it's worth noting in brief that he's a prolific science fiction author. He started in the 80s. He continues up till today. He had a really great novel out just in 2024. Much of his work is quote-unquote hard science fiction in the sense that it plays explicitly and pretty rigorously with concepts from physics, math, and other sciences. More than perhaps any working author, in my opinion, he's repeatedly returned to the idea of consciousness and intelligence and what modifying those what might actually look like. We had been talking about a couple different books, and these, I should say this book in particular connects to some stuff that you've been writing about, some concepts you've been playing with. I was wondering if you could sort of introduce us to why you wanted to talk about Diaspora in terms of scale and scope.
Yeah, so this actually goes back to a very different writer than Greg Egan, which is Jeff Vandermeer. Jeff Vandermeer, when he was writing the trilogy, the Southern Reach trilogy, he spoke about this, and it's also very clear from the book, from the first one, from Annihilation, and also Authority, which is my favorite. I don't know if that's a hot take or not, but
I'll say the podcast agrees.
Okay, good. Yeah, I remember you guys agree. Yeah, so the feeling of fear and the feeling of standing in the presence of something larger than yourself have a lot in common, right? And a lot of times, fear manifests in our unconscious as the feeling of size. Right? Like you dream of a massive wave or a building collapsing or something. That feeling of being so small, right? It doesn't have to elicit fear, though. It can also elicit wonder, awe. Awe is maybe the best word because it's a mix of fear and wonder and so on. When I read Annihilation and also Authority, right, in Authority, there's the scene where they finally played the tape from the original expedition, and there's just something massive in the background. It's like, damn, I've never been more afraid in my life reading a book, right? Like I felt that full body chill. It's like, what's going on? And then I started to think about other books that play with scale. And suddenly it clicked in my mind. I was like, Diaspora, Greg Egan's Diaspora. The other example, which by the way, Diaspora lost the Locus Award to in the year that it was nominated, is Dan Simmons's Hyperion. Well, it lost to The Rise of Endymion, which is when this franchise starts to go off the rails. But Simmons, his personal politics and life notwithstanding, is very, very good at that. Oh, you thought this was as large as I'm going to go? No. I'm going to go much larger than that. I'm going to play with your sense of safety, right? You thought that this is as crazy as it gets, and now I'm going to, you can't see my hands, but I'm quadrupling, I'm exponentially increasing the scale more than you ever thought. And that feeling has a thrill to it, right? Oh, damn, I turn the page and suddenly everything blows up. Diaspora is maybe the best book I've ever read that does this, right? It starts off, as you said, already very far in the future, the year 3000, virtual citizens, Gleisners are manipulating the solar system. Like the scale is already very big. But where you end the book, the beginning of the book is like, I can't even give you an example that illustrates how small it is and inconsequential. So I heard this crazy, this is one of the things that you get told when you're in primary school or high school or whatever, that the distance between you and the center of the universe is the same as the distance between, I don't remember, it's like an atom and an ant or something. And it just like puts everything into this scale that breaks your mind and you go, whoa, right? So Diaspora really connects into that scale. And when that cascade of thoughts happened, I started to notice it everywhere in science fiction. What I think of the first examples is Ursula Le Guin, right? The Ekumen is this big interstellar galaxy, but if you read the early works, she kind of abandoned these ideas later. But if you read the early trilogy, there's a power that destroyed the galactic civilization before the Ekumen that is intergalactic, and it's always like in the background as this massive threat. I covered Ben Garman's The Years Shall Run Like Rabbits for Ancillary Review of Books. He does the same thing. I constantly pull the rug under you and leave you with this wonderment. And last thing I'll say, the person, then I started digging, like, where did this start? Who was the first and so on? And I found Stapleton. Right?
Yeah.
Stapleton, especially in the classic stuff, that's his device is like slowly expanding, Last and First Man and Star Maker and so on, slowly expanding the scope of what he's willing to write about. And I understood that's the thrill. It's the thrill of the courage of the writer to be willing to talk about interstellar minds, galaxies as consciousness, the universe as alive, compassion as a force. Like these are all examples of how you use scale in all these interesting ways. And again, going back to Diaspora, I think it's the best expression of it in a contemporary novel. And by the way, Egan wrote a novel later called Scale, which is explicitly about scale. I haven't had, and I use this word on purpose, I haven't had the courage to read it yet because it looks insanely challenging. I'm not like a mathematically inclined person. Yeah, that's how I got to Diaspora.
Yeah. Okay, so many thoughts. First of all, you should just read Scale. It's not that it has less mathematical underpinning than his other novels, but the surface level of it is you can jump right in more than most. Like, I think, if I remember correctly, one of the surface level plots in it is basically like a PI, like a detective novel kind of thing.
Yeah.
It's great. But so many thoughts. So first off, seconding, I was thinking about Stapledon while reading this and how that is like a key ingredient in a certain kind of early science fiction that I think in a lot of ways has dropped out of when I think of like what have been the big science fiction novels of the last, even maybe like 20, 30 years, not a ton playing with that kind of scale. Like there's like random ones here and there, but it's not like a core thing that people are trying to do as much. Also, by the way, if you know the, what's the podcast, Backlisted, they just did a great episode about Last and First Men, which is one of Stapledon's big novels. But the other thing I was thinking about where you're talking about scope and not to riff too hard on something in the book that I don't have the mathematical chops to understand, but on dimension, where that sense of scope is size, but it's also distance. It can also be other units of measurement.
Yeah.
And this book is very much doing both, where the time one is the one that's most in your face. And I wrote down, there's a section in this book, so it's all, it's framed as these two characters who you meet, sort of like talking to each other and sort of just going over events that have happened. And you eventually figure out that this conversation that they're having is like bonkers far in the future from everything else. But they're just kind of like talking to each other. It's Yatima and Paolo, right? Who are the ones talking?
Yep.
But there's this point where they're just talking and they're reflecting on things, and that you get a little snippet of a thing they're talking about, and then it jumps to the next section they're talking about. And in 5 pages, the novel moves 853 years. And that's a relatively small jump. Like later it jumps more than that.
Yeah.
But it just throws that at you. But the other thing it does is this dimensional shift. That sometimes it's space and distance. Sometimes it's like how far they're moving through the universe. But other times it's trying to expand your concept of how dimensions themselves work, right? There's a whole big thing in this where, so we haven't explained the plot of this much, but there's this gamma ray burst that causes extinction on Earth. And the citizens realize that they didn't understand things as well as they should. So one, they're trying to understand the physics of the universe better. And also they're like, we might need to escape and spread out because some other event could wipe us out. And so they're trying to figure out how wormholes work. And they shift their basic understanding of how dimensions work at like the microscopic level. And they can modify their minds to exist in different dimensional setups than we do. And as a reader trying to read, like, okay, like, I grew up playing video games. Like, I have a very easy time envisioning, like, a 3-dimensional construct, right? Like, super easy. I can imagine, a little computer game, make it as complex or simple as you want. And I can go from 2D to 3D really easily, right? And we have this extra dimension of time all the time. There's no better way to say that. But then when you say, okay, let's go from 3 physical dimensions to 6 physical dimensions, these characters are able to just modify their minds to be able to think in 6 or 7 dimensions in a way that, as a reader, at least for me, like really, really stretches. Like, I don't know what I'm visualizing when I'm trying to visualize how the scenes are described. But it gives this sense, again, of that scale that can go down, too, that like when we zoom down, things get stranger and bigger.
So I was going to say that one of the things that I love about this novel, like people listening, I don't want you to think about dimensions in like pulpy sci-fi ways and alternate reality. Dimension literally in the sense of another unit of measurement alongside depth, width, and so on. But one of the things that I love that this book does, one of my favorite passages is Orlando trying to come to terms with the extra dimensions and the clones. right? So Orlando does this really cool thing where he clones himself. I don't remember the numbers, but like in 16 dimensions. So that clone can then clone themselves in extra dimensions and modify them in other ways. And he creates a chain of personhoods that enable translation from this very alien end state to the beginning, the originator of the clones. But as Egan does for the entire novel, there's a classic Theseus's ship kind of paradox, like which one is the real clone, right? In what way is the clone the originator and the clone the clone? Some clones don't want to merge back. They prefer to either continue to exist on their own, or they prefer to take their own life and cease to exist. And some of them choose to merge. And Egan does this over and over in his book. And very subtly, okay, I'll add one more thing you need to know. He's playing with Hume, right? With David Hume's theory of consciousness and so on. And the very basic question of, there is no empirical evidence for my existence. There's empirical evidence for the existence of my body and the existence of my actions and the result on the planet, on the world around me. But my consciousness has no empirical evidence. We're still searching for it, even like hundreds of years later after Hume. So all that makes me is the subjective experience of time passing and memory creating a cohesive whole, right? That's what Egan is also playing with. If that's true, then there is no difference between the clone and the origin. The clone has a contiguous experience of memory and of existence, and that's it. They're just as real as the originator. But here's the subtle thing that I explained all this to say. He's pointing his finger at you, the reader, saying, in what way are you the person you were when you started reading the story? And I think if you could ask Egan about it, he would say, yeah, my bet is most of the people before they read the story didn't know what a lepton was. I didn't know what a lepton was before I read Diaspora because I don't have a degree in physics or other applicable experience, right? And you didn't know what, femtoseconds were and so on. So he's really asking you, why am I writing this novel, right? I'm changing you. I'm changing the experience of yourself. I'm making you different. And yet, you have this subjective self-identity, right? You are the same person who you were when you started reading this book, but different, right? And I'm very receptive to those questions of identity, difference. Of course, we're not going to get into it, but we're conjuring Deleuze and Derrida and all these guys and the copy and the originator. But it's very funny to call Diaspora subtle. Because it's not subtle at all. In a lot of ways, it like smashes you over the head with advanced mathematical concepts and expects you to keep up. But in other ways, it is extremely subtle, right? And how it turns all of these supposedly theoretical questions back at you, the reader, and your experience of who you are.
Coming back to this and reading it now, a bunch of things jumped out at me. One of which was how many aspects of this novel, and I think Egan's work more generally, are a way more interesting and intelligent and useful take on a lot of the things we're arguing about in terms of artificial intelligence and artificial consciousness and things like that, in ways that I think are just rich, like not just like, he's not making cheap shots here. Yeah. But the way, if you have a background in the sciences and in math, and you believe like, consciousness is real and important, right? And like, ethical standing of personhood is like really big in all of Egan's work. There's a lot of discussions here of what risks are we willing to run to retain ourselves and to be ourselves, even if it has like weird consequences. There's a lot of discussion of that here. But he also has a very thoroughly non-magical idea of what consciousness is. And so like if consciousness is something that can be replicated computationally, which I don't think there's any reason that it can't be unless there's a magic element, which, spoiler reveal, I don't believe there is a magic element. Yeah. So he starts thinking really seriously about, if you have clones, they are both equally important individual beings.
And they have the same rights, by the way.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think that runs through all of his work. And the other aspect of that he's thought about a lot, and I found this, again, like, these are like big transhumanist, far future, like far out there ideas, right? But I found myself thinking a lot about the application, like today, to me, about a lot of his questions about how we should think about modifying ourselves. And he doesn't he doesn't take it in a very like simple for or against kind of stance, but he's just like, no, we do modify ourselves, right? We modify how our minds work. We modify who we are from moment to moment. And he's not saying don't do that and be pure. Like, I think there's a low key, subtle kind of, at some points it's not that subtle, like digs at this idea of purity, right? Like the fleshers who have retained like the classic ancestral human form and like refuse to listen to reason, they kind of come off as, for the most part, kind of like hicks here, right? Like they're sort of like religiously brainwashed. You know, even when they're told like, hey, you're going to get wiped out horrifically and painfully by this gamma ray burst, they refuse to do anything about it. But more broadly, he's just really interested in the fact that, like, yeah, with our technology, with habits, with drugs, with psychological techniques, you know, one day with direct manipulation of our data, if we're fully computational, we'll be able to change how we think, what we think, why we think. And he's able to sort of go one step further and say, how do we step back and think about that, about how we choose what we do? I'm going to read this a little bit. I want to pass it back over to you. So this is a part where two characters, Blanca and Gabriel, are waiting on a result of this big experiment that they've set in place. It's going to take a long time. Oh, and I should mention that most of the characters in the novel use the pronouns vi, viver, viz. So this says, this is Blanca, I think is the main character here, says, V watched Gabriel's face as they waited, cheating the time by a mere factor of 1,000,000, instead of jumping the gap in a single bound. Even if it wasn't a moral issue, relating to the physical world could be a delicate balancing act. Should you dart from significant event to significant event, creating a life devoid of everything else? Probably not. But exactly how much subjective time should you endure between moments you were, in all honesty, desperately waiting for? And I just love that. I've been thinking a lot about the like creative and maybe like spiritual importance of boredom lately. Mm-hmm. Of how like having gaps in your life where you can't distract yourself is really important. It's one of the reasons I cherish like riding my bike a lot, because like I don't listen to anything. I don't look at my phone when I'm on my bike. So if I go for an hour, 2 hour, 3 hour bike ride, like I'm just with my thoughts. And that I realize I don't have a ton of spaces like that in my life anymore. It's so easy to put on some music, put on a podcast, look at my phone, read a book. Like I don't have those gaps. And this book is thinking so much about our relationship to boringness, even to just like how closely should we tie ourselves to the time frame of the rest of the universe if we have the option.
And I totally agree with that, but then I think it goes even one step further, and it says, and this is again one of the more subtle points in the book, is let's say you had this almost infinite power, right? Because the distinction between the reality of the planet that it's punished by this burst and the reality of the policies is it's meaningless for Egan, right? There is no difference between these realities. He even says it explicitly at some point. Today is established wisdom, right? Your brain is hallucinating reality, right? These are the correlation between the images that you see and what reality, quote unquote, actually is a meaningless question. In that sense, we're not Kant anymore, right? This is not the main question we have, because we had Kant and Nietzsche and all these guys kind of like not solved it, but mapped out that space. So you have infinite power because reality is now editable. Right? What is worthy? What is worthy of your time? Not only how much time you should spend and how much you should skip over, but what should you do with the time that you have? So there are many answers in the book. And that's, by the way, one of the things I like. Egan kind of reserves judgment in a lot of cases.
Yeah.
So there is Inoshiro, one of my favorite characters in the book. They're really annoying, but still one of the more interesting characters. And Inoshiri and the group, their aesthetics, right? They're all about aesthetics and experiencing new ways of thinking about reality and messing around with it. But Yatima, the main character, their thing, I have to remember to use the their pronoun. It's very, very hard because it's not like a regular pronoun. Their thing is math, right? Like the pure pursuit of mathematical knowledge. And the Fleshers, by the way, a lot of them are like these conservative religious people, but a lot of them are experimenting biologically with their bodies and experiencing new ways to be embodied, which is also very interesting. So, but the one thing that every single group agrees on, except for the Gleisners, and the Gleisners are being herded by the other group so they don't do it, is expansion. Expansion and growth for the sake of growth is like the cardinal sin for all of these groups. And then it's heavily hinted that the introduce, which is when the policies were founded and a lot of consciousness moved into the policies, was to free up space on Earth so that Earth could exist, have its resources and so on. And the Fleshers have these built-in taboos against reproduction for the sake of reproduction and expansion, extractionism, and so on. And what everyone is afraid of is that the Gleisners will, their switch will flip and they'll decide to become this intergalactic empire. And I found that so fascinating. I mean, Egan has a lot of other anti-capitalist works, like Perihelion Summer is his book about, well, it's not about climate change, but it's about climate change and climate disaster and so on. And it was so interesting to me to go back to Diaspora. I didn't catch on this the first time and kind of tease out this idea of growth for the sake of growth being the one thing that is just evil. It's just plain bad, which I think is really interesting, and also really interesting from a novel at the end of the 90s, right? Today, I think it's more common to hear anti-growth narratives. Again, I'm not making judgment whether they're right or not. There's a lot of debate on that. But it's really interesting to read a book from 1998 or 1997 or whatever, depending how you count it. That's the main idea, that growth is pointless. And instead, you should better yourself, think of new ways to experience reality, ask deep questions about truth and knowledge and so on, instead of just thinking about where you want to scatter your seed. And I also want to read a passage. And this is not from the beginning of the book, but it's tied to the beginning of the book. And I will say that the first 50 pages are some of the best science fiction writing I've ever read.
Oh, it's so cool.
It's so good. It's how would an AI build an AI? Right? How would that look like in mathematical computer science terms? This one is from in the middle of the book where the first real big jump is made where Yatima and Inoshiro leave the polis that they start off in, and a Konishi polis, and they go off into this interstellar journey. And the conceptory, which is the machine that makes the other machines, this is told from its perspective, right? The conceptory observed the orphan moving through the portal, leaving Konishi polis behind. With access to public data, it knew of the orphan's recent experiences. The conceptory wasn't interested in scattering Konishi shapers far and wide, like replicating genes. Its goal was the efficient use of polis resources for the enrichment of the polis itself. There was no way to prove causality, no way to be certain that any of the orphan's mutant shapers really were to blame, but the conceptory was programmed to err on the side of caution. It marked the old, unmutated values for the orphan's altered fields as the only valid codes, discarding all alternatives as dangerous and wasteful, never to be tried again. So Yatima is so weird, they're so experimental, and the end of the book, V pursues this mathematical truth, which is really eccentric and odd, or one of their versions, right? That the conceptory which spawned V deletes the uniqueness of that instance of the code, which is such a cool concept and such a cool idea. And the cardinal sin that causes the conceptory to never again spin off a Yatima is the off chance that their traits lead to expansionism.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a couple points where they say exponential growth is a curse in all its forms. There's this concern. At some point they're talking about, are the Gleisners going to go exponential, or is it going to be us? And someone asks, if anyone screws up and goes exponential. And I think there's something about the taking both the time and the space perspective this has, that like taking for granted that, we could persist for thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions, hundreds of millions of years, no problem. Once you start taking that, it strips away. I think about this specifically in the kind of capitalism that has reached a fever pitch in America is all based on this myth of undiscovered land, right? And this infinite bounty of resources. And this is no, if the Gleisners go exponential, they will eat up all the matter in the solar system. It'll be like a bacteria growing over a piece of fruit, and it'll ruin it all. And so taking really seriously that, even at these huge scales, that I find that really fascinating. And the kind of the multi-leveled respect it has, both for we don't want to go and just carve up the universe for our playthings, and what that will do to us if we become the kind of things that are just going to grow and grow and grow and grow, and that is our only like logic for existing. So much of this book is about, and a lot of Egan's work, like once you get past the sort of like big, cool, science fiction plot things that they're doing, they're kind of asking like, what is life? What's a good life? What's a life worth living? And the way that connects back around here, like really unexpectedly, as you kind of say, to this like kind of anti-growth, anti-capitalist sort of reading is really fascinating and really enriching, because it's not just, I feel like one of the things that solar punk kind of read broadly and a lot of these sort of more hopeful science fiction subgenres or movements make is like you need to find like a really good positive vision. Like, it's one thing to say, yeah, like smash capitalism. Cool.
Yeah.
Like, agree. But like, what are you going to do instead? And this is thinking so deeply about what does it mean to live a worthwhile life if you can live for millions of years and change yourself? And not saying that there's just one answer, but like that is the question you need to be asking.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's coincidence that Egan chose the word polis to describe these kind of nodes of virtual identities, right? Of course, calling to mind the Greek notion of the city-state and so on. And we could go off on a tangent here, like Socrates and Plato and so on. And the polis is the site where people figure out the life that's worth living and so on. And in many ways, a lot of the people that Yatima encounters are philosophers, right?
Mhm.
Gabriel, certainly, Blanca, mathematicians that are so theoretical that they are philosophers. But I think it kind of like, for me, conjures again one of my favorite characters, which is Orlando, who was a flesher that only joined Konishi Polis after the disaster, after Lakirta, the gamma wave burst, and fantasizes about the return to the flesh as this like origin point from which everything spun off. And he's kind of like the radical version of those who think that everything should refer back to the flesh, which is like one of my favorite plot points, right? There's Konishi and other policies that are very abstract, and there's Carter Zimmerman, which is the polis that most of the characters end up in. Their thing is, okay, of course, we're like virtual and abstract and so on, but there has to be some connection back to reality. We can't just like virtually reconstruct the universe and then retreat forever into that and pretend like we're living. There is some authenticity to the first level of reality. And I think Orlando and Carter Zimmerman, they do surface some sort of anxiety that comes from these theories of mind. By default, we balk at these ideas that we're just a jumble of memories.
Mhm.
Whether that means that it's correct or not is something else. But every single person, the first time you teach them about Hume and Descartes and like brain in a tank and all that stuff, they go, no.
Not me.
Not me.
I'm
I
built different.
exist.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. So by the way, I think unironically, that's one of the strongest arguments against Descartes. My high school philosophy teacher, this is what he told us. Forget all these arguments. When I ask you if you're awake, you say yes.
Mm-hmm.
You say yes with utmost certainty. So there's something there. There is some sort of connection. Again, whether it's justified or not, we can ask what that word means, right? But we do feel some sort of connection back to reality and to ourselves. And I just love how Egan treats that in the book. He could have just discarded it and say, you guys are idiots, right? Like math, physics, all of these fields point to these facts, that you are just like a bunch of neurons firing, sharing memories and pretending like there's something more. But instead, he's very sympathetic to these ideas. Orlando is a sympathetic character.
Mm-hmm.
He deals with sympathetic problems. And in general, everyone, one of the most tragic characters is Blanca. Blanca at some point gives up.
Throughout Egan's work, he has a really nuanced interest in, basically in solipsism, in like the risk that you will fall into a universe that is just you. These characters, being these virtual citizens who can create their own virtual worlds and modify their brains any way they want to, that is like sort of really, really apparent to them. And Egan doesn't say like that's bad. He doesn't say like that's evil, but has this like, I don't know, awareness of the kind of tragedy of retreating away from everything and getting disconnected, but also aware that sort of like that's your right, and like has a lot of sympathy for that as well. the way this ends with Yatima just basically in a math nerd cave forever. It doesn't feel like a sad ending, right? Like it feels like Egan saying, like, among many kinds of lives you could choose, choosing to like more deeply understand and think new things about the mathematical world is a really rich one. And he has respect for that. Even though there are lots of other characters in this book that have chosen, like, no, we have to stay engaged. We have to stay engaged with each other. We have to stay engaged with the physical universe. The constant negotiation of how fast or slow should we experience time is one that I find really fascinating all through the novel. But he's aware of that ability to sort of like retreat away from external connectors. And again, I find that mix of sympathy and concern for it really interesting.
Yeah, and I think I agree with you 100%. The perception of time, you already mentioned this, but it's such an interesting way through which to experience what it means to be alive and to perceive. In many ways, Egan explicitly conjures flatland.
Yeah,
multiple times during the novel, right? You could say that flatland is like Diaspora's antecedent almost.
Oh, totally.
Right? Like,
yeah.
It's kind of easier to imagine a 2D reality, maybe because I grew up playing Mario, right? Than to imagine a reality without time.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's the dimension that in many ways gives sense to the whole thing, right? Because without it, there's no action. Without it, there's no change, right? There's no existence in a way. So messing around with that dimension and what it can do and what we can do in relation to it is a really interesting way to like poke at your sense of self and ask questions about it. Like, what happens if you could experience millennia in a day? What would that do to you? What would still be important to you? So yeah, that focus on time, that's where you need an Egan. That is someone who is a computer scientist, someone who understands mathematics at a very deep level, someone who can grapple with these concepts. And I think that's where, I keep contrasting Egan to, like, I don't know, Zelazny, Le Guin, even Philip K. Dick, stuff like that. And like, all those writers are amazing, but they didn't have his chops. Or maybe, who I want to compare this to is Asimov. Well, the ideas are just as grand, but Asimov did not have the grasp of the actual functioning concepts to go as deep as Egan goes. Like, what does it mean to be interstellar? What happens to a society when it goes galactic? In Asimov, it's like, isn't that cool? I'm like, okay, sure, but okay, and here is Egan's like, yeah, but that would require you to fundamentally shift everything about how you think about decision making, for example. And he has the technical knowledge to actually grasp the concepts, all of which to say is like, this is what good hard sci-fi looks like. This is when the hard, what the other example is? Sorry if I'm rambling a bit, but all these like connections are going off. Peter Watts.
Yeah.
I want to be in a room with Peter Watts and Greg Egan just going off, right? Just like bouncing off of each other. Because, Watts in Blindside, he has that entire end of the novel where he cites the physics essays that he's read to make this make sense. And it's not about completionism. It's not about qualifications. It's not about saying, look at me, I'm allowed to talk about this because I read 50 essays and you didn't. It's about, I want you to know that I thought about this all the way through. I took this idea and I ran with it into a certain state of its completion. And that's craft, right? It's skill. It's really nice to see it's really hard to do. And so it's impressive to see someone pull that off. And Egan is maybe the greatest to ever do it in that regard.
No, I agree. And I love Watts' work. And I think putting him next to Egan makes me even more mad that people aren't talking about Egan more.
Oh, yeah.
Because, Watts is taking some similar ideas. He even has in Blindsight, they have the virtual realities that people are like,
yep,
sort of inselling themselves to, right? The
heaven, right?
Yeah. And in the freeze frame revolution, he's thought a lot about really long spans of time. And if like,
man, the freeze frame revolution is like a Diaspora, like not sequel, but like a parallel world.
Parallel world, yeah.
Totally.
But what's so interesting is that Watts' sense is so often depressed and or horrified.
Yeah.
Whereas Egan, I think, even though Egan has like a kind of fear that is in like the awe and wonder kind of direction, he leans way more into an awe and a wonder that to me read more joyfully.
Yes.
Just like, this is so cool and so complex and so big. And sometimes you can have these moments of insight that are just wonderful, and like your whole universe lights up.
Yep.
I don't know, he's a hard science fiction writer, and whenever people complain that like hard science fiction isn't being written, I'm like, Greg Egan is still writing like multiple things every year, but they're very joyous, and I wouldn't want people to get. They're so, I'm not that skilled in math, but I don't understand getting scared off of something because it might throw around some math or physics concepts you don't get. Like, Egan walks you through this stuff kind of like as best you can. Like, I couldn't sit down and do the math, but he kind of like walks me through how the different dimensions work, right? He almost teaches, he has these distinct little sections where he's like, I'm going to introduce you to this concept. The very beginning of the book, you need to think about how these minds work that are artificial, right? And he walks you through that. And you need to think about how these different spheres of influence work. You need to think about how different dimensions work. I'm going to make up this whole branch of physics, right? The Kozak wormholes, and sort of explain to you how that works. And he does that so that then, as you're going through, you can get that really deep science fictional sense of this is just so freaking cool that not a lot of people do.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. And I think another novel that does this really well, like more recently, is To Be Taught If Fortunate by Becky Chambers. She actually writes about something that is connected to Egan's latest novel and that he released last year, Morphotrophic, that I haven't read yet. And that idea there is, what if biology was based around different fundamentals than the fundamentals that we're familiar with? That's exactly what the characters in Chambers' book discover, a non-carbon based life forms. And she really explores how everything is different, like their DNA, the mitochondria, like the whole structure of existence is different than us and how it operates. And that book, I think, runs the gamut between the two other touchstones, like blindsight, depression and loss and sadness, and Egan's wonder. It kind of like in the middle of, again, I'm spoiling Becky Chambers' To Be Taught If Fortunate, but like the expedition is doomed, but they got a chance to, see something completely new and hopefully transmit it back to Earth and so on. So like both those spaces. What's so hard about Watts's work is that nothing goes anywhere. All the revelations, all the knowledge that was built only causes more war and grief and loss and so on. Where with Egan, the only uptick, the only benefit to it is the deepening of consciousness and the deepening of beauty and so on, which is not inconsequential, but it's not like on a scale where Chambers kind of does both, right? Like there is betterment, there is like society moving forward with this knowledge, but also it comes at a terrible cost and so on. So rolling it back to Egan and hitting on that same point again, this is, like you said, this is what I wave at people when they say that hard science fiction is boring. All right. No, Larry Niven sucks. That's not the same thing as hard science fiction is boring, right? The people who have historically written hard science fiction, they suck. They miss the point.
There's also, I think there's this, and we should take a break here in a sec, but there's this distinction that I would like to make where I think, so there's hard science fiction in the sense that it is really rigorously grounded in and using for good effect the sciences, math, physics, right? And then there's hard science fiction that I think is sort of like back defined as basically like not having girl cooties, right? Like it's not like Larry Niven, like, oh, I'm so impressed by the physics and the biology in your books. No, it's just
big guns.
It's got big guns, and it's not Ursula Le Guin. And so people are like, aha, there's Ursula Le Guin, and then there's a hard science fiction, right? And I think we should carve out a little more what we, and when I say we, I mean like we like readers, genre readers more broadly. That when we say hard science fiction, we don't just mean dudes, and we don't just mean the guns and the sexism. Like, we mean stuff like this that's like really digging into the sciences, and there are a lot of different examples of that won't show up on like your classic list of like, here's the top 10 hard science fiction novels you should read. I have so many thoughts here, but let's take a quick break. We'll regather our thoughts. We'll come back and go through some more. All right, we are back. We are still talking about Greg Egan's Diaspora and jumping far farther afield to his other work and some of his ideas he's talking about. One thing that I just wanted to flag, this didn't come up when we were talking earlier, was the specific appreciation this book has not just for teaching, but for learning and what experience itself is. It has this part where Yatima is sort of finding out that V is really interested in math and sort of like being a pure mathematician. And the way that one of the citizens who sort of teaches Ver introduces this concept of the minds, which is this sort of like metaphorical representation of like what is known in math space as this sort of like literal mine through like unknown territory with all these different tunnels branching off and stuff. The offer is sort of on the table that Yatima can just take an area, what is known, and just sort of put that whole sort of like module in their brain and just sort of have it. And part of, and this comes throughout the novel where like people will, I think they call them aspects, is that what they call it? Where they have like, or affects, where they have like a new sort of mental module of how to think about things and they can sort of pass them to each other. But Yatima decides not to do this for most things because of how much the book and Egan values like the personal experience of learning and understanding as like a critical part of understanding it for real. There's a point where it says understanding an idea meant entangling it so thoroughly with all the other symbols in your mind that it changed the way you thought about everything, which I really loved. And I was thinking about, this is not a dig at The Matrix, but like this is like a perfect contrast with the I know Kung Fu moment, right? Or like I know how to fly a helicopter moment, where you take this big complex thing and just plug it in someone's brain, which, you know, sure, maybe that's possible eventually with this kind of technology, but making the point that it's not saying that like that's not real or like Neo doesn't know Kung Fu now, but like if you actually study martial arts, that changes how you think about your body. It changes how you move through the world. It changes how you interact with other people. That has value. And that the way Yatima is going to learn math is this like sort of like slow, personal, integrative way that might open up new ways of thinking about things that otherwise wouldn't come up. And I just thought that was great. You know, I was thinking in this about in Diaspora, this vision of like, I don't think they ever say the word scarcity or post-scarcity in here, right? But this is like a deeply post-scarcity kind of book and a post-scarcity kind of mindset. And how Egan has this vision of that even though it definitely skews math and science, is so much richer than I think a lot of like post-scarcity science fiction. I was thinking about this in contrast with Banks' culture novels, which again, I really, really like a lot. But you know, a lot of the culture novels are basically someone bored or not fitting in is like kind of like the main point of it. And Egan's like, no, man, if you have infinite time, you can study math forever. It's fantastic.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because, again, it interlinks with an actual theory of philosophy, which is the coherence theory of truth, where truth is how thoughts stick together or relate to each other. This is like Pragmatism 101, William James, all those guys. But this idea that if the way to discover truth is through coherence, then slotting in an idea into a network is not the way to understand it. It only allows you to maybe like inventorize it, for lack of a better word. Like it's another line in your inventory of things that you know, but it's not a deep learning because you're not conceptualizing it with everything else. You mentioned martial arts, which is very close, dear to my heart, because I do martial arts and have done for many, many years. And that's exactly it, right? Like when I study martial arts, I'm not just studying the art itself. I'm learning more about who I am before and after class, during class. What is my relationship with violence? What is my relationship with peace? All these ideas, I need to learn them. I can't just, quote unquote, know Kung Fu. I need to become the person who knows Kung Fu. And I super agree with you that it's a really interesting point. And by the way, that's what Yatima ends up doing with their life, right? Isolating and just diving deeper into this mine of truth.
It again is one of those things where, and granted this novel is only, 30 so years old, 20 some years old. It just felt so weirdly prescient today with like the craze for sticking like, LLMs and everything.
Yeah.
And just like the idea that like, yeah, like instead of knowing molecular biology, you could just ask a chat engine to tell you how this
Or,
protein works.
or worse for us is like summarize Greg Egan's Diaspora.
Yeah.
And that's the same thing as reading Greg Egan's Diaspora.
Mm-hmm.
It's not.
This craze for like synopsis and summary and like I don't know. I think it sneakily sort of combines with the wikiization theory of how art works, right? It's like it's just you just have to summarize everything, but the experience of it is so different. You know, going through it, learning it, integrating with it, questioning it, even to that like idea you had of like I think nonlinear reading is like important, right? That like the way you interact with a piece of art, there are different ways to move through it. That you can only do that by moving through it yourself.
Yeah.
What else do we want to talk about with this? I have so many notes here. There's so many other. I just want people to read all of Egan's corpus because I think it's fantastic.
Yeah.
There's a really good, massive collection of his short work called The Best of Greg Egan, Volume 1. I think a Volume 2 is planned at some point that I really recommend to people. And I really, a toss-up when we were talking about what to discuss when we were talking about an Egan novel was, I think Permutation City is like similarly like major.
Mm-hmm.
I'm glad we picked this because I think it points out different directions. But Permutation City has a lot more of those thinking about what happens to brains that have been copied and you can modify them.
You know what's funny? I just realized this when I was reminding myself what Permutation City was about for this discussion because it's been a while since I read it. Amazon made a show called Upload, which is basically Permutation City. It's like minds uploaded after they die. That's the one innovation, right? It's like an afterlife. And then the quality of their afterlife is affected by the amount of resources that they had while living. And they explicitly conjure, by the way, it's a good show. It's a really funny and good show. They conjure the speed of processing, which is exactly the main plot point of Permutation City, right? Like you can afford more processors, therefore you can be better as a copy, therefore you can make more money and so on and so forth. So I just found that really interesting. I don't know if whoever wrote Upload read Permutation City or they kind of like convergent evolution into the same idea, but Permutation City, yeah, it's like Egan's, the big one, right? It's the big one that if you know Egan, that's probably the novel that you know.
And the other thing I would say too, just if people are curious of checking out his work, is that he is characterized as we've been talking, like hard science. He's got a lot of math, a lot of science in a lot of his books. The Orthogonal Rocket trilogy, which is all about like if the basic rules of physics were slightly different, like he writes this like whole society up from that. But I think a lot of his novels, particularly in the last maybe 10, 15 years, are a lot more human and focused on like earthly human things. And we've been saying in this one, you mentioned Perihelion Summer, which I think is so great and really like
really good book.
Interesting, nuanced, thinking about how we deal with privilege and with refugee crises, in the event of big changes. Zendegi is one that I've been bringing up a lot, which is that's from like 2010, 2011, which is about an attempt to create a virtual clone of someone, where I think I don't remember if he has a disease at the beginning, but it's this single father who's concerned about being able to be a voice in his child's life after he dies. And it's about all these iterations of like very up-to-date technology of like, what would it look like to try to, map your brain and make a virtual copy of you that you would trust to watch your own child. And basically like how the problems of that and the struggle of that and like really taking that seriously. And it's this really rich, moving human text that's so opposed to these very like glib, accidentally dystopic ideas of, we're going to copy your grandmother and your kid will get to know her things that are going on right now.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's a great writer, and he has a larger range of interest than just math. I'll put it that way.
100%.
Also, I would refer people to do you know the Modern Masters of Science Fiction series?
Yes.
Karen Burnham has one. So these are like very short, really great little scholarly books that they're sort of like they're maybe like a quarter biography and then 3/4 like really looking at the themes of an author's work. And Karen Burnham's on Egan's work is really, really great.
Yeah, there's a bunch of them that I wanted to read. The J.G. Ballard one. Yeah, there's Alfred Bester. I also like that they chose some non-obvious names. Again, this kind of like maybe a listener is getting the idea that Greg Egan is forgotten. I don't think he's forgotten. He's very much celebrated in his publishing and everything, but I don't think he has the place he deserves. And that conjures up like Alfred Bester and Frederick Paul and all of these guys that were wildly celebrated while they wrote, but today you hardly hear anybody like, please read Gateway
Yeah.
and Tau Zero
Mm-hmm.
and all these books. Like, these are really good science fiction books that are written by, not by Asimov, Heinlein, Le Guin, and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't want Egan to, end up in the same bucket. So I think it's a good idea to talk about him in these formats and choose a lesser known book. I already conjured Bester, so I might as well do the weird space opera spiel in this in this eventuality. So another thing I've been working on for Ancillary is a kind of overview of this subgenre that I'm calling the weird space opera. So, space opera started from this very pulpy origins. You could say that space opera, by the way, is the first science fiction genre to ever exist, right? In a way, a lot of the proto science fiction is space opera.
Mm-hmm.
If you think, I'm thinking like even before Wells and Stapleton, I'm thinking Flamiron and all those guys. And then it became, one of the most commercially successful genres of science fiction. Flash Gordon, all those guys, Star Trek,
Right.
Star Wars. These are all space operas.
Yeah, right.
And of course, the joke, which is true, that's why it's funny, that we always say is like, you can imagine multiple races, but you can't mention gay relationships, right? Like, you can't even imagine a scenario like that. But then in the 70s and the 80s, as part of Slipstream and New Wave and all that stuff, we start to get, instead of rejecting space opera, which is what, for example, Ursula Le Guin did in many ways. She was operating against and Octavia Butler and all those guys, which is also a valid point. A lot of authors were like, wait, let's not just throw the baby out with the bathwater. Let's see what can be preserved. And they also went back to some foundational works like The Stars My Destination by Alfred Bester and other works like it. So draw a line from there to the Centauri device by M. John Harrison, and then from there to a bunch of contemporary works. It's not, I wouldn't say it's common today to read weird space opera. That is space opera that, challenges society, gender roles, perceptions of reality, and so on. But I would posit that Diaspora is a weird space opera. They go into space on increasingly complex ships. There's a lot of opera, right? There's a lot of tension and emotions and expression and soliloquies and monologues and debates and all that good operatic stuff. But it's also really weird. It forces you to like reconceptualize gender. By the way, we didn't talk about gender at all. You could have like an hour and a half discussion just about gender in Diaspora, beyond the pronouns, right? Much deeper than that. And it forces you to reconceptualize society, decision-making, democracy. So this is just like a side note. I think if people are interested in learning more, then first of all, I'll publish my overview. I need to get on it and put the finishing touches on it. But also the Centauri device, The Stars My Destination, Gateway, another like classic work of science fiction that used to be like a household name and in a sense like kind of disappeared, which I think is a shame, by Frederick Pohl, Tau Zero, and more works that we could put into that bucket.
This is a bigger question we can't answer now, but I do sometimes wonder why among I don't know, is there just like a finite size that the canon can be that we got Asimov and Clarke and, we got Frank Herbert and we just can't hold any more in there. I don't know, it's weird, especially because granted, I haven't read Gateway in a minute, but my memory of reading Gateway is that it like blows Foundation out of the water. Like Foundation is just like, 8 pounds of dry toast you have to eat.
Yeah.
And Gateway is like, weird and lots of strange stuff going on in it. I know that's a bigger question. What else we want to say about Egan? I want to say he has a line in here that if Beethoven deserved to endure, so did urination.
Yeah, that's one of the better parts of the book.
I think that's Orlando, who has been obviously because they are controlling their own minds and how they present, how they look, and he has the option never to urinate again, and he has decided it's not worth living millions of years if you don't have the satisfaction of peeing once in a while. I just think it's great.
It's also like a good counter to what I just said about operatic stuff. Like the book can be so self-serious, and if someone else wrote it, it would be a lot more pretentious. But then Egan has all these like small ways to bring you down to earth and remind you that you're reading a book at the end of the day. And he has fun with it.
Eden, thanks so much for coming on. This has been really great. This is really, we've talked a lot about revisiting and returning versus new, and this is a really fun revisit for me. Before we go, anything else you've been working on? Anything you want to talk up? Anything going on at Death Sentence that's exciting?
Death Sentence is kind of in hibernation. Gareth got a book deal, which is
cool.
phenomenal for him. He's going to write about AI and the logic of fascism. He had this really successful article that went up like a year or so ago. He's turning that into a book, and I've read some of it, and it's brilliant. I mean, Gareth is one of the smartest people I've ever known. So I'm really looking forward to that. So it's Langdon and I, and we'll take our time. We're going to do Relentless Melt in like a few weeks. So yeah, things are there. Like, tune in every once in a while. I do want to do a solo episode on scale. I want to take these ideas of scale and I kind of open them up with myself. We recently covered John M. Ford's Web of Angels. So if you're looking for another weird space opera in the same vein as what I just talked about, you could go to SoundCloud or wherever you get your podcasts and listen to our Web of Angels episode. One of my favorite books of all time. Now that I've read it, that's basically it.
Cool. That's awesome. Yeah, well, thanks again so much. Hopefully you have a good hibernating period, and I hope that our time of running around the globe ends up with us running into each other in person at some point here, but we'll see.
Yeah, it's got to happen. It will happen. Thank you so much for having me. This was a blast.
A Meal of Thorns is a podcast from the Ancillary Review of Books, an online magazine founded to address the radical possibilities of criticism, with a focus on speculative fiction, world literature, and utopian impulses. Go to ancillaryreviewofbooks.org for regular reviews, essays, interviews, and more. Our opening poem is by Bartrahari, translated by John Bruff. Our music is by Giselle Gabriel Garcia. Additional music this episode was from Kevin MacLeod's Creative Commons 4.0 offerings, Equatorial Complex, and Fluidscape. Our artwork is by Rob Patterson at The Ratio Farm. If you'd like to support the podcast and the Ancillary Review of Books, congrats! You may be good. A few different ways you can do that. You can join our Patreon. Throw us a couple bucks a month to keep the podcast and the magazine sustainable. You can hang out with us on Discord, and we've got a few other perks on the way. If you're interested in a book we mentioned on the podcast, buying from the bookshop link in our show notes or at the ARB website gets us a cut. It helps immensely if you just help get the word out about the show. Leaving a review, commenting, or sharing on your platform of choice, that really helps. And it's nice to know you're listening. Questions, suggestions, elaborate compliments, drop us an email at mealofthorns@gmail.com, and you can also follow us on Blue Sky for however long that stays cool, and probably slightly past that. By the way, I don't think we mentioned it in the episode, but if you're interested in Egan's work, be sure to check out his website, gregegan.net. You can read a lot of his work for free, and he has notes, illustrations, and explainers for a lot of the concepts that he uses. Next time, Liz Burke is on the pod to talk about Lois McMaster Bujold's Paladin of Souls. It's a good one. Remember to check out the website if you'd like to read further ahead. Keep your eye out for an ARB fundraiser coming up in March. And as always, thanks for listening, and stay critical out there. Causes a mass extinction on Earth. Oh, I gotta pause for the dog. Joe, knock it off.